In the same way that it's possible to measure TCP/IP filtering from a third-party vantage point, one can also measure web filtering in the same way. In this part of the lecture, we'll talk about how to do so using a tool called Encore, and we'll talk about how Encore works, as well as some of the ethical considerations that the tool raises. Encore uses a technology called cross-origin requests to measure web filtering. In contrast to deploying a measurement vantage point in a particular country, Encore deploys technology at the origin website. And the vantage point, i.e. the client's browser, becomes the vantage point by virtue of running code that is served from the origin website. So if a particular user visits the origin website, if that website is running Encore, it returns a small bit of code that asks the web browser to load a particular object from a site that it wants measured. In this particular image, a web browser in Iran visiting a site at georgiatech.edu might get a request that asks the browser to load a particular object from Twitter. And depending on whether that load succeeds or fails, we can get some information about whether or not Twitter is blocked in Iran. If you know about the web security model, you know that it has something called the same origin policy. An origin in the web context is a tuple, the protocol, HTTP or HTTPS, the host name or the name of the website that you're visiting, and the so-called port, which might be port 80 if it's unencrypted HTTP, or port 443 if it's secure HTTP or HTTPS. The security model here is such that a web browser does not permit code from one origin to read information or data from another origin. And so if we go back to our picture, if our code is running at the origin website at georgiatech.edu, it's not possible for our code running over here at the origin to read the data that's loaded at the measurement target. And so the key challenge that Encore surmounts is how to basically get data across this side channel, in spite of the fact that the web security model has this cross-origin request capability. Fortunately, Encore doesn't need to read data. It only needs to know whether the URL succeeded or failed in loading. And restrictions on resource embedding are looser in this context. And as a result, by attempting to load an image or a style sheet or some other iframe with arbitrary content, the cross-origin model allows these attempted loads to issue a callback to the original piece of code based on whether that attempt to load the third-party content succeeded or failed. And it's that callback that serves as the side channel that allows Encore to get this information about whether the attempted measurement succeeded or failed. We can use a collection of these successes or failures to try to infer whether or not censorship is occurring at the domain level, at the IP address level, or at the URL level. If we see a lot of images from the same domain failing, we might be able to infer that the entire domain has failed. If we see a lot of images from the same IP address with different domains failing, maybe we can infer that the filtering is occurring at the IP address level. And by loading specific URLs and determining whether or not those URLs succeed or fail from, say, the same site, we may be able to determine whether or not filtering is occurring at the URL granularity. There are some potential risks to Encore. It loads potentially censored URLs, which might be possibly dangerous to users who may not want to be implicated in loading those URLs. Unfortunately, informed consent is infeasible, particularly given that it may be difficult to inform users of these risks, especially if these users don't even speak English. For this reason, Encore is opt-out. But there are ways to reduce risk. Risk depends on how we use the tool, and in particular what URLs we ask users to measure, and which users we ask to run which particular measurements. And so we can control these risks by controlling our measurements in various ways. It's worth noting as well that there are certain low-risk use cases. In particular, URLs are often loaded with cross-origin requests, specifically to load trackers, ads, style sheets, third-party JavaScript, and many other objects on a website. And so if we want to test URLs like twitter.com or facebook.com or google.com, sometimes those can be low risk because many websites have those domains embedded in them anyway. In summary, Encore enables measurement of web censorship using ordinary web browsers as vantage points. It's a technique for measuring censorship at scale. The tool comes with an emulation testbed that validates the technique, and the tool is also open source. The tool presents a number of ethical considerations, in particular how to conduct these measurements, and who should be asked to conduct which type of measurements, of course, remain complicated ethical issues that need to be considered in the deployment of a tool like Encore.